So welcome everybody. Today we are talking about multi-site, Omni. If we look at our Series 2 webinars, we did last time the site simulation. I don't know, did I do the site simulation with the European customers? I don't think so. But I did that with the North American customers, and you can get the video off of the channel, off the YouTube channel. Not that important, it's a very short 15-minute. Today we'll do multi-site, then next time is redundancy, and then we have advanced local control, a bunch of features in local processing that it's important to know about. So let's jump into multi-site. Now, if you have multiple sites that you want to cover with a single Omni server, then you have two options at your disposal. You can do a single Omni server that communicates with the controllers that are in each site, so that you can program the controller to report to a remote IP address, and then add it onto the master, and you have to program or commission those controllers with a laptop on the site. But once you've programmed them to report back to a IP address on the internet, then the messages then will be forwarded to the server, and you'd have bidirectional communication for the unicast messages between the ELCs and the Omni. Okay, there are some limitations there, and you need a static IP address for the server, but there are a lot of benefits, and it's simple, and we have quite a few sites that are doing that, right? So you've got controllers on a remote site without needing the server, a server at each site. We're not going to be talking about that option today, and maybe it's worthwhile doing a seminar, but you can check out, I believe I did a video on monitoring remote ALCs on the channel. What we're going to be talking about today is where you have a server at each site, and then you want to look at a master server that basically shows whatever's going on all over. Right? So that is the architecture of our remote site extension that goes into Omni. Okay. So what are the applications for remote site extension? One is you, of course, want to integrate multiple sites. You have a customer that has multiple buildings, multiple locations around the world, and they want a single server to connect to see what's going on, whether it be for alerts, whether it be for tracking a tag, etc., looking at the history, all that. You want to be able to have one access point for clients to connect to see what's going on along your entire enterprise, right? So you'd have separate remote site extension servers reporting back to a master server. You might also have separate servers for different, like you have one server for access control, another server for RTLS, another server for intrusion or whatever, and you would want to then, because of, to eliminate single point of failure, etc., you might want multiple servers for that reason, and you would have, so it would be a single geographic location, but multiple themes, and each one would have its own server. The second purpose of having a multi-site Omni is to scale to high volumes of traffic or client connections. So right now we're going over to, for example, web connections. Now web connections, we've got much better capacity than we had with the EV2 connections, but still, if you want thousands of client connections, or you want tens of thousands of badges with over, let's say, 5,000 or 6,000 messages per second on a single server, then one method of balancing the load would be by creating multiple servers. Let's say you'd separate floors to different servers and balance the load that way. And that way you can scale up to as much as you want using the multi-site architecture. Any questions thus far?
No, that's all good.
All right, thank you. and nothing in the Q&A. So let's delve a little deeper into the way we synchronize the servers, the remote servers versus the master server. So we've got two types of synchronization. We've got a single site synchronization, and we've got a multi-site or global synchronization. And if typically the single site would be our readers. So what does that mean? It means that we have readers in each remote site. We have remote 1, reader 1, remote 2, remote 1, reader 2, etc., remote 2. And then they will all appear on the master with their site name, colon, the reader name. On the other hand, we have things like badges that are multi-site. And that means we want to be able to distribute, right, or deploy a badge that's enrolled either in the master or in one of the remote sites to the rest of the remote sites. So I can take my badge and walk to another site and I can continue to be tracked there. I only have to add the badge once. Excuse me. Right? So that's a multi-site. So let's say I add the badge in remote 2, goes up to the master, and then the master then synchronizes with the other remotes. Now, what am I going to see in my database? If I look into I could see in master, John Doe is at remote 2, reader 1. And I'll see that on the master in that respect. And I'll see that in remote 2, John Doe is at reader 1. However, on the other sites, I'm going to see John Doe and its location is unknown. Here I have two web clients. One is on my server, that is my remote server. It's in the other room, actually. And we have this machine, this laptop that I'm using is the master, right? So I called the remote server Tel Aviv. Here it's showing resident Ron is in room 222, lower. That's what I called it because it's my LF here on the board next to me. But if I look in the client that's connected currently to the master, it says Tel Aviv 1, room 222, lower. So I'm tracking the tag and it's showing me the location on the master. If I'm a client of the master, I see site name, reader name as the location of the tag. If I have a look now at my database, you'll see that if I look at my readers, I've got Tel Aviv and all of the readers from that server. If I can now go in remote desktop to this one, I go to my readers and I can see the same readers, the ones that I've synchronized anyhow, that appear here without the site name, right? And if I have a look at my badges screen here, similarly, resident Ron Tel Aviv lower, and if I take resident Ron, I put it in the upper reader, as you can see, it just moved to room 111 upper, right? And if I put it down, it's room 222 lower. So I'm getting all the tracking information from the tag, right? So let's go back to the PowerPoint. So I've got my multi-site objects and I've got my single site objects. Now I can go ahead and I'll show you the screens in a moment, time permitting, how we can actually add different object types to the synchronization, determine if it's a multi-site, single site, what properties of that object gets synchronized. Now, with badges, why is it important that the status type and the badge models be synchronized as well as the badges? And those are synchronized by default. And the answer is because these are dependencies, right? In other words, a badge needs to know what its badge model is. It needs to know what status it is. So when I change the status of the tag in one, it needs to change in the other. That's critical. So all of these dependencies, certain dependencies I might not. Like for example, badge groups, I have a manual synchronization. It doesn't synchronize automatically, but I have to go in and click on a button and say, oh, say synchronize my groups. Keep in mind also that every time I have an object that is now being synchronized, every object in Omni has its own unique identifier. We call it the iris ID. Now what we're doing is when we synchronize the object, we don't know what the IDs are on the other. We don't want redundant, perhaps duplicate IDs. We can't use the same ID in multiple servers because it might already be in use. So we create a new identifier. So now we have a second unique identifier for that object, but that's unique for the entire site, right? Or it's unique on the master. And then every time there's a change, it's searching for that unique identifier on the other. Okay. Now, when I have my remote sites and my master sites, keep in mind that I can still use each server independently. So in the remote sites, of course, I communicate with a network of LPAS or CenTrak tags and hardware and supervise, etc. I can connect with clients to the remote site, in which case I will see only the alerts, I will see only the badges. Well, I'll see all the badges, but as far as location that are associated with the remote site, and I can get history off of that. And that history will be recording the events that occurred on the remote server. Now let's go to the master. On the master, similarly, I can connect with the client to the master and see all the tags and all the locations, right? The master can also have its own LPAS or CenTrak hardware connected to it. So I don't need necessarily a dedicated machine to be a master. Let's say I have two sites. Theoretically, I only need two servers, one remote and one master, and the master can also manage the network on that site, right? And sometimes it might be better because it's up in the cloud and we want to be able to just keep it independent, and it might be a cleaner architecture, but theoretically, the master server can be used as well to drive its own hardware, right? And of course, the history here will be all of the relocations that it gets, for example, or button presses, or et cetera, all of the events, right? That is, and similarly remote too. That's how you've got clients and histories that could be connected to Eve. That's why also how we can kind of scale as well, right? So that's any questions thus far?
David, it's Matt here. Between the synchronization between a remote site, between, let's say, the master and the remote one, if there's any connectivity lost, how does it resynchronize in between? Was that something you want to answer a little bit later?
Right. Good question. So let's see. Ha! There you go. You preempted my next slide.
Aha, thank you.
Okay, so there is a caching performed, and frankly, you can determine whether it will cache or whether it won't cache, and when the extension will do a full synchronization and when it will always rely on the cache, right? So theoretically, right, we need the cache, of course, for events that occur that we don't want to miss. Excuse me. Alert events for sure, right? But alert events is a different. We're talking about a cache. Let's say a tag moves from place to place, the location change, and it occurs while the systems were not in, where there was no communication. There was a drop in the communication, or the server crashes, the master crashes, or for whatever reason, it's not reporting those data changes, those database changes. So it will cache it. Now the question is on reconnection, should it do a full synchronization? Should it run through the cache only? these things can be configured in the system. But we do have a sophisticated caching mechanism. More than that, fortunately, we have online with us Miro. If we have any time permitting later, maybe he can go into a little bit more detail about the caching mechanism. But let's leave that for the end. Any other questions? But that was a good one, Matt.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay. Now the question is, okay, we leave alert events for later.
Sorry, David?
Yeah, sure, Jacek.
The 2 slides back, when you were showing those multiple sites, yeah. The master server looks like it's got connection only to the history of its own El Paso CenTrak network, but obviously you have also access to the history in remote 1 and remote 2.
The history extension in the master is recording all of the core events, i.e. relocation, button presses, motion, etc., that occur to the badges that are currently in the database, which include remote badges, right? So if a remote badge relocates from remote 1, it is then propagated and synchronized and sent to master. That relocation is recorded in the master's history because it's a relocation, right? So it's recording whatever is sent to the master, but it's not, right? There are certain events that are not synchronized will only be recorded in the history of the remote. We're not synchronizing the SQL databases. Is that a good answer to your question? Yeah.
So what about the alarms that occurred in remote 1 or remote 2? Are they also recorded in master?
I haven't yet gone into alerts. Let's talk to alerts, but alerts that occur in remote 1 that are sent, not all alerts are necessarily sent to the master. The user configures that. Which alerts are sent? The ones that are sent to the master that trigger a remote site alert on the master side will, of course, be recorded in the history on the master side. It's an alert event that occurred on the master. That gets recorded in the history. But if I have an alert that is not sent to the master, it will only be recorded in the history of the remote server. Okay. We're good, Jacek?
Yes, good, thanks.
Yeah. Okay, quiet my telephone. Right. So let's talk a little bit. We're still in the synchronization of events that occur, not alert events. Okay, we're just talking right now about badge events, and as you can see here, and again, credit to Miro for his wonderful graphics. We have a relocation that's getting reported up to the master. We have another relocation after some period of time. It gets reported to the master. Then the remote will not report another event, core event, for a period of 1 second. So if you have, as you can see here, a motion relocation within 1 second here on the right side, you will see that the middle relocation will be missed. You won't get that relocation. So there is a throttling that the extension is doing in order basically to control load on the communication channel between the, by the way, we are talking about HTTP traffic that is going between the servers. This is web services that we're not talking about a low level. So there is kind of an overhead of parsing, et cetera. That needs, we want to be able to make sure that we can scale well with this. So we're throttling the data. Plus, if you talk about the reporting the last seen badge, let's say the tag is reporting regular supervision, right? There's no change in state of the badge or anything, then that it will only keep it alive. Why? Because if you look in the clients on the master side, right, you've got the last time seen. Now that last time seen is being updated. And you want to do logic for lost away. So if a tag goes lost away on the master, meaning it ceases to get messages from the remote, then you might want to alert on that. So the regular supervision messages will get throttled for a period of 5 seconds, right? So if you have multiple last seen, i.e. messages from a specific tag, they will be filtered, and only after 5 seconds will it send one. So that's a little bit about the throttling of the messages from the remote to the master. Now we get to alerts. And alerts, the way it works is we can define on the remote which alerts to send to the master. And then on the master, I define what's called a remote site alert. So I'll demonstrate. So on we're on here, the remote site. And if I go to the remote site configuration, and I go to my alerts, I'm telling it, I'm checking off which alerts that I have defined on this machine shall be forwarded to the master. And that way I can segregate certain alerts. I just want locally in that site. I don't want to send it to the master. Other alerts are important to reach the master. So I select it. Here they're all selected, but theoretically I can just select one or two or just a portion of those. And then I go on the master side. Here's my EV2 on the master side. And I define an alert called a remote site. So if I add by type, for example, I have here the remote site alert. Right, I've already defined one here. Where I'm able to specify some variables here, including the object. I'm not really sure what that object is. Is it a badge? Is it some other object? Because we don't know in advance what type of alert is going to be received. Now, if I go to the inputs, this is where I define, I want this alert to report on events coming from this remote. I only have one, but if I had multiple remotes, this alert can be defined for alerts that are sourced or originate at one of or many of the remote sites. And I define what alert types, okay? This is not a list of alerts that were defined on the remote, but they are alert types that are currently defined within the master server from whatever extensions are in there, right? Then I say, okay, I want an LPAS badge alert. Anytime I get an LPAS badge alert from the remote to trigger this alert, right? Now, let's say, okay, let me just demonstrate that before we get going. So I'm gonna
attack on a staff member.
I push the button on my tag. I got attack on resident Ron in the remote, and here I got remote staff attack alert. Okay, so I get the name of the alert in the default message. I have not. I could have defined a custom message, but I didn't. Right, and if I look in the alerts themselves, again, hit my.
Attack on a
I'm getting
staff member.
remote staff attack alert, resident Ron, locations Tel Aviv, room 222, right, and etc. So that's the remote site alert. So I'm defining a remote site alert. That has proven to be a little challenging because let's say I want to be able to route the alerts on the master based on a location of the alert in the remote. So one of the new features that Miro added to the system is to be able to say, okay, on this alert, I'm on the remote now, right? So I have remote site, staff attack, right? Staff attack alert. I can set some type of a string and call it first floor attack. I could take that and set that. So now that's the string that's sent along with this alert. And then on the other side, now when I define the remote site alert, on the inputs, I can put that filter, user data filter. So what we're doing is we're sending another string along with the alert so that if I do any kind of filtering on the remote side, i.e. location, status type, time zone, right, badge group, etc. All of those filtering, now I have multiple alerts on the remote that I want to be able to route differently of the same type, right? Just the LPAS badge, they're all LPAS badge alerts, but I want to route them differently on the master as far as clients go, let's say. Then I can define separate remote site alerts, each one with its own filter. So that's an enhancement from the latest version that, or actually the version that will be released, the 5.2.2. So back to, that's regarding the alerts. Any questions? Okay, we're coming up to the half hour. Recent enhancements. So again, synchronization of CenTrak objects. We needed to make some changes to support all the CenTrak synchronization badges that are not LPAS type. And yeah, that required quite a bit of work. And this upcoming release will support both LPAS and CenTrak objects. Additional filter on remote site alert for alert routing. That's what I just demonstrated to you. And the transition from our GSOAP to Apache technology, which we needed to do for licensing reasons, basically. Okay, so let's see, 19, wow. Trevor, hey, Trevor. And Robbie's on. All right, so what we've said was basically we've got different types of synchronization. We've got single site and global synchronization. Typically badges are global, readers are single site. How we can see it on the server, when we see on the master, the location includes the site name and the local and the reader name, right? We talked about the alert synchronization, alert event synchronization, and how we can route them based on a user data that you stick in there, and it filters based on that. Any questions? Okay, good. Miro, if you can just describe the different caching options here. You know what? Let me quickly open that up for you guys. If I go to the setup and I'm going to remote site, I didn't show you how to set this up, but there is a document explaining how to set up the remote site extension. So here I'm at adding my remotes, and here in the mode, I tell it that this server is a master, and then I'll add a remote and define the URL of the remote. And on the remote, I'm going to go in and define where the URL of my master. Here I define which alerts, but in this case, we're a master, so it doesn't really matter because we're not sending these alerts. And here are some advanced, we'll talk about that in a minute. In the synchronize, this is where we can manually add objects to be synchronized, and we can add properties. So if I have an LPAS badge and I want to add certain new properties that need to be synchronized together, this is where I would add it, right? I would add a new property and say, okay, give it, it's a type of a string, etc., and give it a, here, I can do a time object, etc. And here, I'm not really sure how the tag dependency works, but if one object is if you want to do sort of a join between one object and that tag, i.e. the property, then you can create a dependency between objects on that. So there is like a whole user interface to script your synchronization and you can do your own objects, create objects in Omni and have them synchronized that way. But going back to the advanced, okay, here we have the ability to reset a session, purge single side objects, so it'll clean it out, and then that would get rebuilt the next time the remote gets started up. And here we have synchronization of badge groups. This is where you do the manual synchronization, as I mentioned. And offline cache, do not use offline caching. That's to your question, Matt. That's an option. And maybe, Miro, you want to just explain the difference between these two options, use cache reset on session ID change and on database ID?
Okay, sure, David. Hello to all. Okay, basically, what is database ID and what is a session ID? Database ID is actually unique identifier of the Omni database. So when you restart the Omni server, the database ID remains the same. Session ID is actually a session running instance of the Omni server. So it says when you restart the master or any slave, the cache will be reset. So you're going to lose the offline cache. A perfect example is, okay, the slave is running. Due to some reasons, the remote actually site, yes, slave site is running. You lose the connectivity. The remote site starts caching its events, and then it gets the connectivity again. So before sending the events, which the events being cached to the master, it is going to check, okay, has the session ID changed? If the session ID changed, it means that the master has been restarted. Has the database ID changed? If the database ID is changed, it means not only that the master has been restarted, but it is using the different database. Different database means everything is completely different and there is no point of using any cache.
Caching, right, because you might not be consistent. You might have...
Yes, you're having completely different configured system.
Right, excellent. Thank you very much, Miro. And great, well done to Miro on this, as usual. Yeah, okay. So if there are no other questions, let me see Q&A, nothing there. If there are no other questions, we'll call it a day.
Thank you, David.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, David. Thanks, Maro.